I wonder why my name is printed on that envelope. That was the first thing that caught my eye. My name. Printed too neatly. Placed too deliberately on the edge of the conference table, as if someone wanted the decision to look clean. I hadn't even sat down yet, but a faint pressure tightened behind my ribs. The kind that warns you something has already happened, and you're the last to know? I'd arrived early, like always, 7:15 a.m. The building was still half asleep, the hallways quiet enough to hear the hum of the server spine through the walls. I was halfway through reviewing overnight logs when my screen flashed, executive meeting. Immediate, no agenda, no sender. When I stepped into the room, 3 faces avoided mine. That told me more than their words ever could. Sabina. HR began. Her tone rehearsed. We need to address ongoing concerns about your attitude. My attitude. The phrase landed strangely light enough to dismiss, sharp enough to wound. A folder slid across the table. Inside were pages of internal notes, none bearing dates or signatures I recognized. I scanned them once, twice. Manufactured. Sloppy. Someone hadn't even bothered to mimic my team's writing style. The decision had already been signed yesterday evening, before the accusation, before this meeting, before anyone pretended to ask for my side. A thin chill crawled up my spine. Not shock anymore, just clarity hardening into something colder. I set the folder down. Understood. No one met my eyes. The walk out felt both too long and too short. A slow drift through hallways I had held together for 15 years. My badge was still warm in my hand when my phone vibrated, once barely a whisper against my palm. Key personnel status changed. The message came from the interlinked operations relay, a system that didn't send alerts without reason. Not to me, not ever. I stared at the notification, a dull thrum spreading through my chest. I didn't know what the change meant yet. Not fully. But something in the architecture had shifted the moment they let me go. Something they were not prepared for. The strange thing about walking back to your desk after being dismissed is that the world doesn't pause for you. People keep typing. Printers keep humming. Screens keep glowing. Everything moves on as if your absence has already been rehearsed. My steps felt disconnected from the floor, almost like they belonged to someone else. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't crying. I wasn't anything, just hollow, with a quiet ringing in my ears, as though the building itself was receding from me. When I reached my workstation, conversations evaporated in a ripple. A few colleagues glanced up just long enough to register what had happened, then looked away with practiced neutrality. The way people avoid staring at an accident they can't help but hear. I opened my drawer and began placing my things into a small box slowly, methodically, each movement deliberate, almost ceremonial. The coffee mug with the chipped rim, the flash drive labeled Archive A, the photo of our team from the year we stabilized the tri-network pipeline after the hardware meltdown. Pieces of a life lived in fluorescent light. As I zipped my laptop sleeve, a shadow appeared beside my desk. Thomas, one of the younger engineers, stood there with both hands in his pockets. His expression was tight, conflicted, as though he wanted to say something, but fear beat him to it. He pressed his lips together and gave a quick, almost imperceptible shake of his head. Don't ask. The gesture struck deeper than any words would have. He knew. They all knew, and none of them could afford to stand close to me now. I nodded once to show I understood. He stepped back, shoulders hunched, disappearing into the glass-walled workspace like a ghost retreating into daylight. My badge lay on my desk, its worn edges catching the overhead light. 15 years. 15 years building the infrastructure they depended on, stitching together systems that were held up as examples of national reliability. I traced my thumb along the badge clip, remembering the late nights, the rolled-up sleeves, the moments I'd fought to protect the integrity of our network even when leadership didn't understand the risks. The weight of those memories pressed against my ribs, familiar, loyal, bruising. And now I was being written out of my own story. I powered down my workstation for the last time. The screen dimmed, reflecting my faint outline. Already fading, that was the moment the grief hit, not loud, but deeply, quietly, the way real loss arrives, a slow tightening in my throat, a warmth behind my eyes I refused to let spill. Not here, not where they could mistake my silence for weakness. Before leaving, I logged into the employee portal out of habit, my profile loaded with its usual sterile layout employment history, project records, performance evaluations, everything I'd poured myself into. Condensed into rows of text, I scrolled to the most recent entry, quarterly behavior review. The signature at the bottom jumped out at me. It belonged to someone who had never once worked beside me. A stranger had written the sentence that ended my career. The numbness deepened, not anger yet. Not clarity either, just the cold realization of how easily a life's work could be overwritten by a single false line. And for the first time that morning, something inside me finally cracked. The first night after losing a job doesn't feel like a night at all. It feels like a long, colorless corridor where time drags without direction, and every familiar object in your home becomes a reminder of something you no longer belong to. I sat at my dining table long after the sun had slipped behind the horizon. The only light coming from the glow of my laptop. The silence around me wasn't peaceful, it was hollow, wide enough for doubt to echo. For a while, I couldn't bring myself to open anything. I just stared at the blank desktop, feeling the weight of the day settle into my shoulders, like sand pouring into a jar. My mind felt empty, scrubbed clean by shock. But emptiness never lasts. Eventually, something else seeps in to fill its place. For me, it started as a faint, barely formed question, why today? Why like this? I opened my email archives, scrolling slowly through years of messages updates, system logs, approval chains, nights spent coordinating with teams across time zones. Every message a snapshot of a life that had seemed stable just 24 hours earlier. I searched for anything that might explain the sudden turn, something I had missed. Nothing, no warnings, no conflicts, no changes in my performance metrics. The hollow feeling twisted into unease. To distract myself, I moved to my documentation folders. My hands knew exactly where everything was: 15 years of architecture diagrams, contingency plans, network migration blueprints, all meticulously organized. But as I scanned the files, something struck me, an absence so subtle I wouldn't have noticed it on any other night. There was no signed document transferring ownership or access control of the core infrastructure I'd built. Nothing bearing my approval, nothing acknowledging a successor. The realization surfaced slowly, pushing aside the fog in my mind. I never signed anything, not once in 15 years. My breath caught. That wasn't just unusual, it was impossible. No system of that scale, no national-level infrastructure, ever operated without proper ownership transfer protocols. And if I hadn't signed them, then who had the air around me sharpened? I opened the folder containing the original Tri-Company Alliance contract, the backbone agreement that allowed us to operate as a unified network. It was a document I hadn't touched in years. My hands moved faster now, guided not by memory, but by instinct. Buried deep in the appendices, exactly where I had left it 12 years ago, was the clause that changed everything: Key Personnel Technical Custodianship Amendment B. My amendment, my language, my technical safeguards. I remembered writing it late one night, insisting that stability required a single custodian whose removal would automatically trigger a system halt until a formal, compliant transfer of authority was conducted. I clicked open the file. The text looked the same on the surface, but the formatting felt off. Lines broken differently, spacing too uniform. Someone had edited it. Recently. A cold thread of suspicion tightened in my chest. I checked the metadata. Created by Sabina Carter. Last modified by unknown user timestamp. 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago, long before today's accusation. Long before anyone confronted me. Long before the so-called attitude report had magically appeared. Someone had tampered with my clause. Someone who didn't understand that PDF metadata is far harder to erase than text. The emptiness inside me finally cracked, replaced not by fear, but by a sharp, emerging clarity. The logic snapped into place one piece at a time, forming a picture more deliberate and more dangerous than anything I'd imagined when I walked out of that building. They hadn't just removed me. They had triggered something they couldn't control, and I was starting to understand exactly what that meant. I didn't sleep. The discovery of the altered clause had pulled every nerve in my body taut, but exhaustion eventually dulled the edges of my fear. By morning, what remained was a slow-burning unease, an ember buried beneath ash. I moved through my apartment on autopilot, brewing coffee, folding the blanket I hadn't used, opening blinds to a day that felt too bright for what I knew was coming. Something inside the system would respond to my absence. I just didn't know how quickly. I found out before I finished the mug. My phone vibrated with a series of alerts, short, clipped, systematic. Not from the company. From the Interlinked Alliance Relay, the independent overseer that monitored cross-company network synchronization. I tapped the first notification, and the words hit me like a cold wave: personnel invalid. Tier 2 operations frozen. There it was, exactly what Amendment B had been designed to do. The clause was intended to prevent unauthorized leadership changes from compromising system stability. If the designated custodian me were removed without a compliant transfer, the system would lock its second-layer operations, routing intelligence, dynamic load balancing, predictive failure controls. Essentially, the brainstem of the tri-network infrastructure. Without those processes running, everything would start to drift off balance. Another alert followed, then another. I opened my personal dashboard, the one connected to the Alliance interface, rather than my old company's domain. They hadn't revoked it because they couldn't. The interface was tied to the national relay, not corporate HR. As the dashboard loaded, my unease settled into something heavier. 3 flashing indicators. 3 companies affected. 3 separate system degradations unfolding in real time. The first company, my former employer, showed intermittent node instability. The second, a logistics partner, was experiencing packet delays severe enough to disrupt freight routing algorithms. The third, an aerospace communications network, showed rising desync errors. What had been theoretical in my mind only hours earlier was now happening with terrifying precision. Email notifications from the Alliance support queue began pouring in, escalation flags stacking faster than I could read them. Unexplained freezes, routing loops, authorization failures. Each entry was marked urgent, each one a symptom of Tier 2 shutdown. Somewhere in those companies, people were beginning to panic. A pulse of guilt moved through me. Not because I caused this, the system was following protocol exactly as it was designed, but because I knew what it felt like to be on the other side of a malfunction you didn't understand. I imagined engineers scrambling, executives demanding answers, teams searching logs that would reveal nothing except a single immutable fact. The system acknowledged no custodian. I stared at the dashboard, the rising tension in my chest settling into a dense, controlled weight. I understood the architecture better than anyone alive. I also knew there were only 2 ways the situation could unfold: chaos or compliance. And compliance required the one asset none of them had anymore: my authorization key. I scrolled deeper into the alert logs, seeking confirmation of what I already suspected. The lockout protocols were fully engaged. The system wasn't just frozen, it was waiting for a specific digital signature, waiting for one action to release the Tier 2 operations and stabilize the entire network. My phone buzzed again, this time with a direct message from the Alliance relay, not a system-wide alert. Tier 2. Unlock pending required signature. Carter S. Primary key. I exhaled slowly. Of course. In all the chaos they had unleashed, in all the desperation to remove me, quickly and quietly, they had forgotten the one thing that truly mattered. The system didn't care about HR decisions. It didn't care about accusations or office politics. It recognized only logic, design, and the authority embedded into its foundation 12 years ago. My authority. What had begun as a low thrum of dread shifted into something colder, clearer, more deliberate. I wasn't powerless, far from it. The entire network, 3 corporations, a national infrastructure, and an alliance worth billions was now suspended in a state only I could resolve. And for the first time since yesterday morning, I felt the fear recede, not because the situation was safe, but because I finally understood the shape of the battlefield. The call came just after noon, right when I'd started to believe the alerts might slow down long enough for me to breathe. My phone lit up with an unfamiliar federal relay code, one I hadn't seen since the earliest days of building the Alliance infrastructure. For a moment, I simply stared at it, feeling my throat tighten. That code was only used for one purpose: national-level coordination. I answered, "Miss Geese Carter," a voice said immediately, calm, clipped, undeniably official. "This is Joel Marston from the National Operations Directorate. We're seeing a Tier 2 freeze on the Tri-Network system. Are you aware of this?" My mouth went dry. "Yes," I managed. "I've been monitoring it." "Good," he replied, though his tone carried no relief. "Because, according to our logs, the system lists you as the designated key personnel custodian. We need to know why your authorization has been invalidated." The knot in my chest pulled tight. For a second, I wasn't sure I could form the words. "I didn't invalidate it," I said quietly. "I was terminated yesterday morning, without transition protocol." There was a sharp inhale on the other end, a small sound, but enough to shift the air. "Terminated," he repeated. "You were removed from your post." "Yes." Silence. Heavy. Pointed. Meaningful. I could almost feel him recalculating the implications. "Ms. Carter," he said finally, "do you understand that the key personnel clause is a binding requirement of the Alliance? The Tri-Network cannot legally operate without your certification in place. Your removal automatically forces a Tier 2 lock, and no company, not even your former employer, has the authority to override that." The words struck deeper than I expected. Not with fear, but with something more complicated: an ache. A flicker, as though someone was finally seeing the truth beneath the accusations I'd been handed. I swallowed hard. "I know," I said. "I built the clause." Another moment of silence, different this time. Not disbelief, recognition. "You built it," he murmured, as if piecing together a story that had been scattered and ignored. "That explains why the system's response is so absolute. Your architecture doesn't allow partial overrides. It was designed that way for safety." I said, "If a company could remove a custodian at will, they could destabilize the entire network by accident. And now," he added, "they've done it anyway." The knot in my throat loosened. "Just a little," he continued, more cautiously. "Ms. Carter, 1 week ago, we contacted your company's leadership. We flagged discrepancies in their personnel transition logs for your position. We told them the system would trigger a lock if they proceeded without proper transfer." I closed my eyes. A week ago, they'd been warned. They knew the consequences and still chose to push me out quietly, hoping no one would notice. "They ignored us," he said bluntly. A slow, controlled breath filled my lungs. The sting of humiliation that had followed me since yesterday began to shift lightning, reshaping into something steadier. "They didn't tell me anything," I said. "They just handed me a folder and manufactured an excuse." "Then they've compromised the Alliance," he replied. "Every system dependent on Tier 2 operations is currently degrading at an increasing rate. The only remedy is full recertification by the original custodian. By me. Yes. Only you." The ache in my chest unwound, replaced by a rising clarity, not anger this time, but validation. Precise, undeniable validation. They hadn't fired a replaceable employee. They had removed the one person the network couldn't legally or technically function without. And now the people who truly understood the system, The people whose work affected the entire country were calling me for answers. Not HR. Not my former executives. Me. Joel's tone softened, almost imperceptibly. Ms. Carter, we need your cooperation. The Alliance depends on it. I straightened slightly, feeling a quiet strength settle into my spine. I'll help, I said, but on record I was removed without cause. Any repair must acknowledge that. Another pause. Then, solemnly understood. When the call ended, I set the phone down gently. The devastation of the past day no longer felt like a collapse. It felt like the beginning of leverage. The hours after the federal call felt unreal quiet, in a way that hid something volatile underneath. I sat motionless on my couch, laptop open in front of me, the Alliance dashboard pulsing with warning signals like a distant heartbeat. Red indicators multiplied, branching across the interface node outages, stalled routing queues, cascading delays. But I didn't panic. Not anymore. Shock was over. Fear was over. All that remained was calculation. The network was unraveling exactly the way the architecture dictated when a custodian was removed without authorization. It wasn't chaos. It was consequence. By mid-afternoon, headlines began appearing on my newsfeed: nationwide logistics delays, critical routing disruptions, Alliance infrastructure under investigation. Each article circled the same question: what had caused a tri-network system, stable for over a decade, to suddenly stutter? They didn't know my name yet, but they would. My phone buzzed again, this time with a familiar corporate caller ID. I let it ring twice before answering. Sabina! The CEO's voice rushed out, brittle around the edges. We need your cooperation immediately. No greeting, no apology, just desperation carefully wrapped in authority. I leaned back. Quiet. You'll have to be more specific. We're locked out of Tier 2 operations, he said, as if I didn't already know. Our teams can't access critical systems. The Alliance is demanding answers, and we assure them we're handling it. But we need you to fix what you broke. I finished. There was a sharp inhale, the kind someone takes when they're not used to being confronted. He recovered quickly, or tried to. We need your help. Sabina, this is bigger than internal disagreements. Internal disagreements. That was how he framed the attack on my career: an inconvenience. A minor conflict. Not the deliberate removal of the one safeguard the network depended on. Before I do anything, I said, keeping my tone smooth, you're going to tell me why I was fired. We can discuss that later, he said too quickly. Right now, the priority is reinstating functionality. We need your credentials. Your no? I said calmly. The priority is honesty. Why was I fired? Silence burst across the line, thick and unwelcome. In that moment, I could almost hear the gears turning, the frantic scrambling of executives, realizing that the narrative they had prepared wouldn't work on someone who built the system they were trying to manipulate. Sabina. He tried again. You can't. A faint whisper broke through on his end, so quiet I almost missed it. A second voice. A man. Legal counsel. We can't sign it back in place without her. The rest was muffled by a hand covering the microphone. But it didn't matter. I had heard enough. They couldn't restore the clause. They couldn't bypass me. They couldn't even initiate a new transition protocol without my digital signature. Every safeguard I had written 12 years ago, every line of logic meant to protect stability, was now a lock they could not pick. I'm not agreeing to anything, I said. Until you explain the accusation, the report, the signatures that weren't real. You're being unreasonable, the CEO snapped, panic fraying his tone. You're jeopardizing national operations. No, I replied softly. You jeopardized them the moment you removed me. Another silence, longer this time, in that stillness. Something inside me shifted, not emotion this time, but clarity, a steady, rising strength. They weren't asking for help. They were begging for access to something they no longer controlled. And I knew, finally and fully, that the humiliation of yesterday had already begun reversing its weight. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. "What do you want?" Sabina. Question he should have asked long before they tried to erase me. I didn't answer. Not yet, instead. I said, "Call me back when you're ready to tell the truth," and hung up before he could breathe another word. My hand didn't shake, my pulse didn't race. I simply stared at the dashboard as the indicators continued to flash. Calm as a surgeon watching the predictable outcome of a flawed procedure, for the first time since this all began. The spark of something fierce flickered inside me, small, contained, but unmistakably alive. Not revenge, recognition, and the beginning of control. The call from my former CEO had barely ended when a new notification appeared on my phone, this one quieter, cleaner, carrying no traces of panic or desperation. Just a single line of text incoming, call Halcyon Dynamics, Office of the CEO. For a moment, I thought fatigue was playing tricks on me. Halcyon was our largest competitor, the company we measured ourselves against during every quarterly briefing. Their systems were sleek, their market presence aggressive, their leadership notoriously hard to reach. CEOs of companies like Halcyon didn't call engineers. They called other CEOs. I hesitated before answering, a prickle of uncertainty running up my spine. "Ms. Carter?" a warm baritone voice said as soon as I picked up, smooth in a way that didn't try to hide its authority. "This is Adrian Locke. I hope this isn't a bad time." My breath caught not from fear, but from something sharper, almost like pride. He knew who I was. Of course he did. Anyone watching the Tri-Network collapse unfold would know the origin point. "It's unexpected," I said carefully. "But I'm listening." There was a soft exhale, almost a laugh. Unexpected seems to be today's theme. A brief pause. "I'll be direct. We've been monitoring alliance stability, and we're aware of the key personnel clause tied to Tier 2 operations. We know the custodian of record was removed without authorization." Custodian of record. The phrase hit me with quiet satisfaction. "You understand what that means?" I said, "I do," Locke replied. "It means the entire network is frozen because one person holds the digital key. And that person is you." Hearing it spoken aloud clearly, without hesitation, felt like something settling into place inside me. A confirmation of everything I had tried to suppress since the moment HR slid that folder across the table. The feeling wasn't triumph. Exactly. But something close to it. A reminder that the years I spent building the Alliance infrastructure meant something. That my work had weight. Still, pride wasn't enough to blind me. "And what is it you want from me?" "Mr. Locke perspective," he said. "And perhaps an opportunity." My pulse tightened with caution. Opportunities from competitors typically come with fine print. This time his laugh was audible. "Fair. But you're in a position few people ever reach, one of extraordinary leverage. You understand the architecture at a level no one else in the Alliance does. And unlike your former employer, we appreciate what that means. A compliment wrapped in strategy." He was good. "And what exactly are you offering?" I asked. "Conversation." He said simply, "Not demands, not orders. A conversation about what your expertise is worth and whether you might want to work somewhere that values it." The words landed gently, but their meaning reverberated with force. Somewhere that values it. The opposite of the humiliation I'd endured yesterday morning. The opposite of being erased. But caution threaded through my thoughts. Admiration could also be manipulation. I needed to understand his angle. "Why now?" I asked. "Why call me today?" Locke didn't dodge the question. "Because this isn't the first time you've shaped the direction of the industry. 2 years ago, when we made an offer to acquire your company, the board rejected the deal, publicly. They said the valuation was too low. Privately," he paused. "Privately, we were told the acquisition couldn't move forward because one of your conditions remained unresolved." My heart slowed. "What condition you?" he said. "The board refused to approve the sale unless you signed a transfer agreement for the system you built. You refused. So the deal died." A quiet shock rolled through me, not painful, but illuminating. The company had dismissed me with a fabricated attitude report. Yet 2 years ago, I'd been the barrier preventing them from being absorbed by their biggest rival. They'd needed me then, and they needed me now. Only Halcyon had the honesty or boldness to say it plainly. "I didn't sign," I murmured. "And thank God you didn't," Locke replied. "Because today, you're the only person who can unlock the alliance, and I believe someone with that level of capability deserves a seat that matches it. A seat, not a job. A seat. Think about this. Ms. Carter," he said softly. "Your former company treated your expertise as disposable. We see it as foundational." As the call ended, a quiet warmth flickered inside me, small but unmistakable, for the first time since this ordeal began. The darkness didn't feel suffocating. It felt like a tunnel with an exit ahead. Adrian Locke didn't wait long to follow up. An hour after our call, an encrypted meeting link appeared in my inbox, accompanied by a single line, "When you're ready." I clicked it before I could second-guess myself. His face appeared on the screen, composed, measured, the kind of executive presence that didn't need to intimidate because it already commanded. But I wasn't the same woman who had been blindsided at 7:15 a.m. 2 days earlier. The exhaustion, the humiliation, the years of being underestimated, they had compressed into something sharper, something steadier. He began without small talk. "Ms. Carter, I'll be direct again. Halcyon would like to offer you the role of Chief Systems Officer, full authority over integrations, infrastructure, and alliance operations. It was a generous offer, a powerful one, 5 years ago. I would have accepted it in a heartbeat. But not now." I leaned back slightly, feeling the old weight of swallowed frustration rise to the surface, not as emotion, but as clarity born from years of biting my tongue while decisions were made by people who didn't understand the systems they controlled. "I appreciate the offer," I said, "but I'm not interested in a position that manages only one branch of the operation." His eyebrows lifted just a fraction. "What do you have in mind?" The Sabina of last week might have hesitated, softened her words, framed them cautiously. But that woman was gone. The network was failing. The alliance was calling me directly. My former employer had publicly demonstrated how little they understood the consequences of removing me, and Halcyon, their largest rival, knew exactly what kind of leverage that gave me. "I want authority over the entire technology division," I said. "Every system, every integration, every alliance interface. I want signature control over operational documents. If my expertise is what stabilizes the network, then I won't lend it under partial authority." Adrian didn't flinch, if anything. He seemed impressed. "You're asking for a lot," he said, but there was no disapproval in his tone. "I'm asking for what the situation requires," I replied. "The alliance won't accept anything less, and neither will I." A slow nod formed, deliberate and contemplative. "You're right," he admitted. "You're absolutely right," for a moment. Neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't tense, it was evaluative, like a bridge forming between two people who recognized the other's competence without needing proof. "Sabina," he said finally, "there's something you should know." My pulse tightened. Information was rarely offered freely at his level. He continued, "The role you're describing, full operational control, already exists here. We created it last year. Anticipating the next phase of alliance expansion." He paused. "But we haven't filled it. Not because we couldn't, but because the board agreed the position should remain open until the right person appeared." My breath stalled. "Why tell me this? Because the board wasn't waiting for just anyone." He said, "They were waiting for someone the entire industry would recognize as indispensable. Someone whose absence would destabilize the network and whose presence would restore it." A quiet shock rippled through me, not the disorienting kind from earlier days, but the kind that clarified everything around it. You mean, yes, he said simply. We anticipated that your former company might mishandle the key personnel clause. They've been mismanaging their internal transitions for years. All it took was one legal misstep to make room for a leadership correction. Leadership, not management. Leadership. And you're telling me this because the board believes you belong in that role, he said. And, frankly, after watching the last 48 hours unfold, so do I. A warmth quiet, determined spread through my chest. It wasn't flattery. It wasn't ego. It was recognition. The kind I had deserved for years but never received. I'll consider your offer, I said, my voice lower, steadier. Good. Adrian replied, take your time. But understand, this halcyon isn't offering you a way out. He held my gaze. We're offering you a way up. Sunday night settled over my apartment like a soft, heavy blanket, quiet, unmoving, letting every thought rise to the surface whether I wanted it to or not. The world outside was calm, unaware that a national system sat frozen, waiting for a single signature. Inside, I sat at my kitchen table with nothing but the glow of my laptop and the weight of 2 decades resting against my ribs. I opened an old archive folder, one I hadn't touched in years. The file names alone brought memories flooding back, versions of the routing engine, early diagrams of the tri-network core, the first feasibility audit that most executives had dismissed as too ambitious before it became the backbone of the alliance. These were the pieces of my career no one ever saw: the long nights, the stubborn persistence, the dozens of solutions that failed before one finally worked. As I clicked through each document, a quiet stillness settled within me, not numbness, but something deeper, a recognition of the life I had built with my own hands. Line by line, architecture by architecture, 20 years of work, much of it invisible, all of it essential. I found myself whispering a question into the dim room. Why am I here? Not in the literal sense, not in this apartment, not in this moment, not staring at documents from a life I'd been forced out of, but here in the larger sense, here at this crossroads, here with the alliance calling me, competitors offering me leadership, and my former employer unraveling because they never understood my worth. If my purpose had been revenge, the system's collapse would have tasted sweet. But there was nothing sweet in watching something I built struggle without proper guidance. No satisfaction in seeing engineers scramble through architecture too deep for them to navigate. No pleasure in the panic I knew was sweeping through conference rooms across the country. I didn't want destruction. I wanted recognition, not applause, not praise, just truth. The truth of what my work meant, the truth of what I had given, the truth of who I had always been, even when others were too blind or too insecure to acknowledge it. The hum of my laptop snapped me out of my thoughts. A new email notification blinked in the corner of the screen. The sender's name made me still. Ethan Rowe, a senior engineer, someone who had once spoken over me in meetings, cutting off explanations he didn't understand. Someone who had dismissed the alliance architecture as over-engineered and insisted that simplifying it would make it easier for newcomers to manage. Someone who had made me feel, more than once, like my attention to detail was an inconvenience instead of a safeguard. His email was short, barely 4 sentences. Sabina, I know you're no longer with us, but we've spent the last 36 hours trying to stabilize Tier 2. We can't. The system is beyond us. I reread the words slowly. There was no arrogance, no excuses, no disguise. Just truth raw, stripped down, unmistakably honest. At the bottom, an additional line appeared, one I never expected from him. I'm sorry for how I treated you. I didn't understand how much of the system lived in your head until it wasn't there anymore. A strange feeling stirred in my chest, nothing triumphant, nothing vindictive. It felt still, deep, strong, like a tree's roots settling more firmly into the ground. His apology didn't erase the years of being overlooked, but it clarified something the collapse hadn't humbled me. It had humbled them, and in that quiet, the answer to my earlier question surfaced. I wasn't here to punish. I wasn't here to protect my ego. I was here to reclaim what had always been mine, my value, my voice, my rightful place in a system that had depended on me long before anyone admitted it. Outside, the night remained undisturbed. Inside, something within me finally locked into place. The storm wasn't coming. It had already begun, and I was no longer standing in its shadow. Monday morning didn't feel like a beginning. It felt like an exhale long overdue. Steady and clean. For the first time in days. The world outside my window wasn't a blur of problems waiting to unravel. It was simply morning pale sunlight, a quiet street, a silence that no longer felt suffocating. I dressed without rushing, choosing a dark blazer I hadn't worn in years. Not armor, not disguise. Just something that felt like it belonged to the version of myself I was stepping into. When the car Halcyon sent pulled up, I didn't hesitate. The building was already buzzing when I arrived. A different kind of energy than the fear-driven scrambling happening at my former company. This was anticipation-focused, sharp, full of intention. An assistant led me through a hallway lined with glass offices until we reached the executive briefing hall. Inside, the entire leadership team was already seated. A long oval table, screens glowing, voices hushed as I entered. The room shifted, not dramatically, but with a subtle acknowledgement. Like a tide pulling itself into readiness, Adrian Locke stood at the front. "Good morning," he said to the room, but his eyes settled on me. "Let's begin." He didn't ease into it. He didn't build suspense. He simply spoke the truth, the way strong leaders do, plainly, boldly, with no space for doubt. "As of this morning," he announced, "Halcyon Dynamics is appointing Sabina Carter as our new Chief Executive Officer." There was a beat of silence, not shock, not resistance, but the quiet intake of breath that accompanies recognition. A moment that confirms something people already sensed but couldn't yet name. For me. The feeling was different, not triumph, not vindication, something deeper, something like release. I took my seat at the head of the table, the room adjusting around the new center of gravity. Adrian slid a digital pad toward me. "Alliance recertification," he said. "Tier 2 unlock authorization. The moment you sign, the system stabilizes." My fingers hovered over the screen for half a heartbeat, not from hesitation, but from the weight of the moment settling into my bones. This was the architecture I had devoted years of my life to broken, frozen. Now waiting for my signal to breathe again. I placed my digital signature on the line, instantly. The dashboard on the wall lit up warnings turning yellow, then green. Routing nodes synchronized. Data streams normalized. The tri-network core re-established its heartbeat, steady and strong. 20 years of work pulsing back to life. Someone in the room exhaled with audible relief. Around the country, engineers would see the shift. Dispatchers would watch their systems resume. The Alliance Oversight Committee would receive alerts confirming operational restoration. My name would appear in every log indelible, irrefutable. It wasn't just a fix, it was proof. A notification chimed on the central screen breaking news. Adrian gestured for the assistant to open it. A headline filled the room, Tri-Network Freeze. Traced to mishandled custodian removal, former employer, violated $3.8 billion contract. The article was blunt. Investigative reporters had uncovered the personnel logs. The warnings from federal oversight. The forged internal review used to justify my removal. The termination had automatically triggered contractual penalties. My former company's stock was already plunging. A soft murmur swept through the executives. I felt none of the bitterness I once feared might overwhelm me. Only clarity, calm, steady, grounded. They had tried to erase me, and instead erased themselves. Adrian turned back to me. "You brought the Alliance back online in under a minute. I built it to respond that quickly," I said. A few people smiled, not at the efficiency of the system, but at the certainty in my voice, because I wasn't an engineer pushed aside in a conference room. I wasn't a liability stamped with a false report. I was exactly what the system had always known me to be: necessary, capable, undeniably in command. As the meeting shifted toward next steps, new leadership plans, and public statements, I allowed myself one quiet moment of stillness, not to savor revenge, but to acknowledge the truth I had finally reclaimed. My value was never theirs to define. And now, the entire industry could see it. The collapse of my former company didn't happen with a dramatic explosion. It unfolded the way most corporate disasters do, quietly at first. Then, all at once, as if the structure had been hollow for years and only now decided to give way. By Tuesday morning, the headlines had shifted from speculation to confirmation. Investors were pulling out. Federal oversight committees had opened formal investigations, and the alliance had exercised its right to terminate all contractual ties due to the unlawful removal of a key personnel custodian. A $3.8 billion mistake, made in a single morning, signed with someone else's pen. The news should have made me feel triumphant. But what settled over me instead was a deep, steady sense of closure. Not revenge, not triumph, just the knowledge that the truth had finally taken its rightful shape. At Halcyon, the executive team briefed me on the fallout with a mix of professionalism and barely concealed astonishment. They've been hit with 4 separate lawsuits from major shareholders, Adrian said during our morning meeting. And that's just today. I nodded, reading the filings, scrolling across my tablet. Every line pointed to the same core issue: the board had violated alliance protocol by firing the one person whose authorization was legally required. It didn't matter how they spun the story, the documents, the timestamps, the metadata, all of it formed a trail as clear as the lines of code I'd once written. Still, part of me felt the faint tug of pity. I knew many people still working there: engineers, analysts, supervisors who didn't deserve to watch their company crumble around them. They were bystanders to leadership's arrogance, trapped in a system that rewarded obedience over insight. By Wednesday afternoon, things grew worse for them. The former CEO held a press conference, attempting to reframe the narrative. This was a rogue action, he insisted. Sabina Carter intentionally withheld critical authorization in retaliation for her termination. Hearing my name spoken like that, flattened into a headline accusation, should have angered me, but it didn't. The anger never came, only a calm certainty. Halcyon's legal team forwarded me the video. He thinks he can shift liability onto you, they said. I watched the clip once, then shook my head. He's forgetting something. What's that? Adrian asked. Metadata doesn't lie, and neither did the paper trail. Within hours, multiple journalists published side-by-side comparisons: my original amendment, untouched and properly archived, and the altered version, modified by an unauthorized employee 2 weeks before my termination. The changes were sloppy, inconsistent with alliance protocol, and in a twist that almost felt poetic, the edit log showed the user didn't even understand the cascading consequences of modifying that clause. Then the real story broke. A leaked internal memo revealed that the attitude report used to fire me had been written by a junior employee in the HR department, someone barely 6 months into the job. He had been encouraged, implicitly, if not explicitly, to produce documentation that would support leadership's transition initiatives. He admitted he'd never worked with me, never spoken to my team, never reviewed my contributions. He just wanted to impress the executives, and they had been foolish enough to accept it. The moment the memo hit the internet, the narrative shifted completely. The public saw the termination for what it was: incompetence disguised as authority. The investors saw negligence. The alliance saw breach of trust. And I saw something I didn't expect: relief. Not the satisfaction of watching them fall, not even vindication, just relief. Relief that the burden of proving myself, of explaining the complexity of my work, of fighting to be heard in rooms where decisions were made carelessly, that burden was no longer mine to carry. The truth had surfaced without me needing to lift it. Later that evening, standing in my new office overlooking the city, I felt something settle within me, a quiet release, a recognition that my former company's downfall wasn't my victory. My victory was that I was no longer tied to them. The justice unfolding across news screens wasn't loud or dramatic. It was clean, honest, inevitable, and finally, it wasn't my responsibility. The quiet in my new office didn't feel empty. It felt intentional, like the room had been designed not to impress, but to acknowledge. Morning light spread across the glass walls, brushing gently over the polished desk, with my new title engraved on a nameplate: CEO, Sabina Carter. I let the sight settle in, not with disbelief, not with triumph, but with a kind of peaceful recognition. This wasn't a victory I had chased. It was a place I had grown into. I walked toward the window and rested my hand lightly against the cool glass. From this height, the city moved like a single, steady pulse. Nothing about the view was dramatic, yet something about it felt profoundly right. Just days ago, that pulse had been disrupted by a decision rooted in arrogance and ignorance. And now, with one signature, the system had steadied because I had steadied it. The gentle knock at my door came as I exhaled. "Alliance briefing notes," my assistant said, placing a folder on my desk. "They're requesting your long-term vision." Long-term vision. A phrase no one at my former company had ever asked me for. I opened the folder, skimmed the projections, then closed it. Numbers mattered, but what mattered more was direction. When I stepped into the conference room, the leadership team rose not out of obligation, but respect. The air felt different from any room I had ever entered before. They weren't waiting to judge me. They were waiting to hear me. "We're going to lead differently," I said. My voice didn't need force. It carried itself. Transparency, integrity, a culture where engineers aren't footnotes, but foundations. "We will build systems that are resilient because they are honest. No resistance, no dismissive glances, only nods, steady, understanding." After the meeting, I returned to my office feeling something shift inside me, not power, not pride, but maturity, a calm born from finally standing in a place where my work and my worth aligned. A soft envelope lay on my desk, hand-delivered, sealed with the insignia of the National Alliance. Inside was a single handwritten note: "Miss Carter, we've never seen a single individual restore an entire national system with one action. You didn't just fix the network, you restored its faith in the people who build it. Thank you." I let the words sink in, not because I needed validation, but because this was acknowledgement from people who understood the weight of responsibility, people who knew that what I had done wasn't an act of retaliation, but of stewardship. This moment didn't feel like revenge. It felt like release. I had spent years being overlooked, spoken over, minimized by people who believed controlling decisions meant understanding them. And now, without raising my voice or burning a single bridge, I had stepped into a role where the full scope of my experience was finally recognized. I turned back to the window, letting the sunlight wash over the room. I didn't think about my old company, not their downfall, not their panic, not the headlines chronicling their collapse, because this office, this clarity, this new beginning wasn't about them. My real victory wasn't their failure. My real victory was reclaiming myself, my dignity, my voice, my place in the work I had shaped for 2 decades. And now, as you listen to the final chapter of this journey, I want to ask you, which moment in this story stayed with you the most? Was it the firing, the federal call, the system collapse, or the quiet note that reached my desk today? And where are you listening from right now? I'd love to know. If Sabina's journey inspired you, please share your thoughts in the comments. Your engagement helps bring these stories to life. And if you'd like to hear more stories of resilience, justice, and quiet triumph, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. A new chapter always begins with a single step, and sometimes that step is taken in silence.